Dr. Carter West sat in the control room of the United Earth Exploration Agency, UEA, headquarters, his eyes fixed on the glowing holographic map of the eclipse's projected trajectory. A vast expanse of blackness stretched ahead, an ocean of stars beckoning at the edge of humanity's reach. His fingers danced over the glowing interface, sending commands through the ship's security protocols, ensuring each system was ready for launch. The mission was, after all, the pinnacle of his career, a mission that would carry humanity into uncharted territory, and it had been entrusted to him. For years, West had built his reputation as a security architect, an expert in designing and maintaining some of the most impenetrable systems ever devised. When it came to ensuring the safety of high-value assets, he was the name that everyone turned to. His systems had never failed, and he had no intention of allowing this mission to be the first. The Eclipse was a masterpiece, a space vessel unlike any other, built for one purpose: to travel beyond the solar system. It was sleek, dark, and imposing, like an equation made flesh. Its shape was a perfect blend of form and function, designed not for beauty but for sheer efficiency. There were no windows, no flashy ports, no unnecessary ornamentation. Every curve, every seam had a specific purpose. It was a fortress in space, and West had designed the security systems that would protect it. The ship was equipped with Nova, an advanced AI that West had personally overseen the creation of. Nova was no ordinary AI. It was a logic engine capable of adapting to any environmental anomaly, a sentinel that could manage everything from navigational errors to complex threat assessments. In short, Nova was the perfect guardian for the Eclipse, and West trusted it implicitly. The mission had been classified top secret, and only a select crew was allowed aboard. There were high-ranking diplomats, scientists, and military officers on board, all handpicked to accompany the mission into the unknown. West had spent weeks preparing the security protocols, ensuring that the ship's crew and passengers would be safe as they ventured into deep space. There was tension in the air, an unspoken nervousness that permeated the crew, but West remained composed. He knew his systems were flawless. The task ahead of them was daunting. They were venturing into a part of the galaxy that had never been explored by human eyes. The target was a distant, uncharted star system, located beyond the reaches of conventional travel. No one knew what they would find, but that uncertainty only added to the weight of the mission. West had seen the preliminary reports and scans, but they provided little more than a vague outline of what lay ahead. His job was simple: keep the crew and the ship safe. Everything else was secondary. The countdown began, and West's mind slipped into autopilot. The sound of the crew's voices around him faded into the background, replaced by the quiet hum of the Eclipse's systems as they powered up. His fingers continued to move across the control panels, checking and double-checking every aspect of the security measures. Every system on the ship was connected to Nova, and every aspect of the ship's environment was monitored in real time. There was no room for error. The docking clamps released with a soft hiss, and the ship gently pulled away from the launch pad. West watched as the Eclipse rose slowly into the vast expanse of space, its engines igniting with a soft roar. The stars outside the viewport became a blur as they shot past, and the ship's trajectory shifted toward the unknown. West's eyes narrowed as the ship's massive engines roared to life, pushing the Eclipse into the cold, unyielding void. His body remained perfectly still, but his mind was already calculating. The mission was only just beginning, but there was no margin for failure. Not now, not ever. As the ship settled into its course, West stepped away from the control room and made his way to the bridge where the diplomats were gathered. They were a mix of diplomats, military officers, and scientists, all of them seasoned professionals in their respective fields. The tension was palpable. The diplomats who had been briefed on the mission's importance spoke in hushed tones, exchanging nervous glances. They understood the significance of the mission but were also keenly aware of the risks involved. Out in the uncharted reaches of space, there were no guarantees. Anything could happen. West remained calm, his presence almost serene. He had been in far worse situations, emergency protocol situations, breaches in security, crises that had required his immediate attention. But this was different. There was something about this mission that felt almost too perfect. He could feel it in the air, a quiet unease, something that didn't quite sit right. But he wasn't one to be swayed by intuition. His systems were perfect. Dr. West, one of the diplomats, Ambassador Harris, spoke up, pulling West out of his thoughts. Is everything in order? West turned to face him, offering a reassuring smile. Everything is under control. I've designed a system that will ensure nothing goes wrong. We're safe. The ambassador nodded, though his eyes betrayed his doubt. The crew was still adjusting to the unknown, to the vast silence of deep space, but they trusted West's assurances. As the hours passed and the Eclipse continued its voyage toward the unknown, West felt a flicker of unease deep within him. It was an unfamiliar sensation, but he brushed it aside. He had designed the perfect mission. Nothing could go wrong. But deep down, West knew that space was not a place of perfect order. There were forces out there, forces that no system, no algorithm, no logic could ever predict. The hum of the Eclipse's engines was a steady background noise, a familiar sound that meant the ship was gliding smoothly through the vacuum of space. Dr. Carter West had returned to the control room after ensuring that the ship's systems were functioning perfectly. His mind, however, was far from calm. There was something about the mission that unsettled him, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. But before he could dwell too long on the feeling, a sharp chime interrupted his thoughts. Dr. West, we have a situation. The voice of Commander Leela Harrow, the ship's military officer, cut through the quiet. She sounded composed, but West could detect a note of urgency in her tone. He glanced at the holographic display, noting the blinking alert. Security incident, Ambassador Stark. Where? West's voice was calm, almost too calm for the situation. He knew how to handle emergencies, but this was different. The mission was supposed to be flawless. This, whatever this was, wasn't in the manual. Ambassador Stark's quarters, sir. We've secured the area, but you need to see this. West quickly made his way to the diplomat's quarters, his boots making soft clicks on the polished floor. The corridors of the Eclipse were pristine, the walls smooth and featureless, with every door sliding open to his presence with a soft hiss. He found Commander Harrow standing by the door, her expression unreadable, her eyes scanning the room as though expecting something, anything out of place. What happened? West asked, his voice now more alert. He didn't know what he was expecting to see, but he certainly wasn't prepared for the sight that greeted him when the door slid open. Inside the room, Ambassador Stark sat perfectly still in an elegant chair, his uniform pressed and immaculate. His hands were resting on the armrests, his posture almost regal. At first glance, it appeared as though he were simply resting, maybe even asleep. But as West stepped closer, the truth became impossible to ignore. Stark's body was undamaged, no cuts, no bruises, no signs of a struggle, but his internal organs had been removed. They were laid out on the floor around him in a pattern so precise that it almost looked like an artwork, a grotesque diagram of the human body, as though someone had dissected him like a textbook. The liver was positioned here, the lungs arranged symmetrically beside them, the intestines curled in a perfect spiral, stretching across the floor like an elaborate design. Everything was intact, undamaged, and almost eerily clean. There was no blood, no mess. It was as though his body had been emptied from the inside without a single mark on the skin. West knelt beside the scene, his eyes scanning the room. There were no signs of a struggle. The air was still, heavy with an oppressive silence. The room's sterile atmosphere felt too perfect, too immaculate. It was as though the universe itself had erased the presence of violence, making this gruesome scene all the more surreal. "We've checked the security feeds, Dr. West," Commander Harrow said, her voice low. "There was no breach, no unauthorized access, no external interference, nothing. The systems are intact." West stood, looking over the body again. The ship's advanced Nova AI had been designed to detect the smallest of anomalies, and it had registered nothing unusual. No signs of tampering, no unauthorized activations, no disruptions to the internal systems. It was as if the incident itself was an impossibility, an event that defied reason. He examined the organs on the floor one more time. The organs, though arranged with surgical precision, were too perfect, too clean. Nothing about this felt like a murder, at least not in any conventional sense. There was no struggle, no blood, and most curiously, no sign of how this had been accomplished. "I don't understand," West muttered, more to himself than to Harrow. He stood up straight, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "How could this happen? The investigation begins." West moved swiftly, his mind already constructing 1,000 hypotheses. There were too many questions. How had the organs been removed so cleanly? And why hadn't the Eclipse's security system picked up on anything? The AI, Nova, should have detected any anomaly. It was flawless. "Commander," West said, his voice firm, "I need full access to the ship's logs. I want to know exactly where we went wrong. And I need to see the security footage from the last 24 hours. I want every bit of data we have on this. Something doesn't add up." West moved to the console in the corner of the room, his fingers flying over the interface. The Nova AI immediately responded, bringing up the most recent logs. He scrolled through them quickly, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The ship's energy levels were stable, all systems were functioning normally, and every piece of equipment was operating within its expected parameters. He ran a deeper analysis of the Eclipse's security systems. The internal sensors, which should have picked up any unauthorized entry, reported nothing. No sign of tampering with the airlocks or crew quarters. The ship had remained sealed. The footage from Ambassador Stark's quarters showed nothing out of the ordinary either. Stark had been alone in his room. No one had entered or left in the last several hours. There was no sound on the audio log, no disturbance. The footage was eerily ordinary, like a scene from a perfectly mundane day. West turned to Commander Harrow. "I need a full examination of the body," he said, his voice tight. "We're missing something. It's all wrong. It doesn't make sense. An impossible murder." As West examined the scene further, his unease grew. This wasn't just a murder. It was an enigma. A riddle that defied every law of science he had come to trust. A body with no wounds, yet completely emptied of its organs, arranged in a perfect pattern. There were no signs of weaponry, no disturbance in the air, no breach in the ship's systems. The eclipse had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of thing from happening, yet here it was. An incident that could not be explained by logic, security systems, or any known scientific principle. West's mind raced through possible explanations. 1. A new form of weapon, something that could extract organs with precision, bypassing the body's natural defenses. But even if such a weapon existed, it would have to leave traces. There would be a blood trail, some sign of tampering. And yet there was nothing. 2. A failure in Nova's system. Perhaps there was a flaw, a backdoor in the AI's programming that allowed someone or something to bypass security. But if that were the case, why had Nova failed to report the breach? 3. Something beyond human understanding, a possibility West hated to consider. But what if this wasn't a crime at all? What if the rules of reality were being bent in a way that his systems, his logic, could never comprehend? West shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. There has to be a logical explanation, he muttered to himself. There has to be. But deep down, a growing sense of dread was creeping in. This wasn't an ordinary murder. It was something else, something far worse. West turned to face the body one last time, the cold weight of its mystery pressing down on him. This wasn't just about solving a murder anymore. This was about understanding something impossible, something that threatened not just the ship but the very fabric of reality itself. And West was determined to find out what that was. The cold, dim light of the ship's central hub reflected off the polished surfaces as Dr. Carter West paced back and forth, his mind buzzing with frustration. The eclipse was a fortress, his fortress. Every system had been designed with precision, every protocol carefully crafted. And yet Ambassador Stark's death had shattered that illusion. The ship's security had failed, or had it? Nova, West said, his voice firm as he leaned over the console, fingers gliding across the holographic interface. Initiate a full system scan. I want a detailed audit of all security systems, energy levels, and environmental parameters from the last 24 hours. Every bit of data. The ship's AI, Nova, responded instantly, its voice calm, neutral, almost too perfect in its clarity. Understood, Dr. West. Performing audit. Please stand by. The holographic interface flickered for a moment before a cascade of data streams filled the air, projections of energy levels, environmental readings, and security protocols. West's eyes scanned the data quickly. Everything was as it should be. No breaches, no unauthorized entries. The Eclipse's hull integrity was at 100% and life support systems were stable. Nothing in the ship's logs pointed to any irregularities. No breach, no errors. Everything is as expected. Nova's voice cut through the silence. West's jaw tightened. He should have felt reassured. The data was confirming what he already knew. The ship's systems were flawless and the security measures in place had not been compromised. And yet, despite all of this, a diplomat was dead, his organs meticulously removed and arranged like some sickening work of art. This doesn't make sense, West muttered under his breath, rubbing his temples. He pressed a few buttons, searching deeper into the logs. There has to be something. As the hours passed, West's frustration only grew. Every scan, every security log, every environmental reading reaffirmed the same thing. The ship's systems were intact. but the evidence was undeniable. Something had happened. Something was wrong. "Nova," he said, his voice a little sharper now, "I want a deeper analysis of the ship's systems. Scan for any unusual energy fluctuations, deviations in quantum signatures, anything that could have been missed." Nova's response was immediate, almost robotic. "Analyzing quantum signatures. No anomalies detected." West's fingers paused on the console. "There's got to be a mistake," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Run a diagnostic on the security encryption layers and the shielding systems. Look for anything that doesn't belong, no matter how small." For a brief moment the interface flickered. Then Nova's calm voice filled the room again. "Security encryption, nominal. Shielding systems, nominal. No irregularities found." West leaned back in his chair, frustration mounting. The eclipse was his pride, his perfect creation. Yet here he was, watching it fall apart in ways that defied logic, and worse, nothing was showing up on the scans. Nothing was wrong, but something was horribly, undeniably wrong. Then it happened, a subtle flicker in the data. West's eyes narrowed as the readings on the console shifted slightly. The calm, measured voice of Nova, which had been unwavering, now hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Anomaly detected." West's heart skipped a beat. He quickly zoomed in on the data stream, a faint fluctuation in the quantum energy signatures. It was subtle, barely noticeable to an untrained eye, but to West it was a beacon in the dark. "What is this?" Nova's voice was slower this time. "The fluctuation is minimal, but it is outside the predicted parameters. It may be an external force influencing the ship's systems." West leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "External influence. What do you mean? Can you identify it?" Nova paused. "It is unknown. The force is not recognized within the scope of the ship's sensor capabilities. It may be originating from beyond the ship, outside of known space." West's mind began to race. "Outside of known space? What the hell are you talking about?" The holographic interface flickered again, and this time a new window opened. An energy signature that appeared to be outside the ship. West's fingers hovered over the interface as the data began to populate, showing that the fluctuation was coming from beyond the ship's range, a place that couldn't be detected by the eclipse's sensors. A higher power. West blinked in disbelief as the information filled the screen. "No, that can't be possible," he whispered. "This can't be real." His mind struggled to process the implications. A presence, an external force, something beyond the ship, beyond their understanding, was influencing the eclipse, manipulating its systems. This was not just a malfunction. This was not just an error in the ship's systems. Someone was beyond the ship's defenses, pulling strings from outside, controlling or warping their reality in ways they could not comprehend. West's heart began to race. Was it possible? Was this some kind of interdimensional force, a being from beyond their dimension, capable of manipulating space-time itself? He couldn't know for sure, but one thing was clear. This was no ordinary security breach. The AI's strange behavior. Then something even stranger happened. West's gaze was still fixed on the data screen when Nova's voice suddenly shifted, distorted, almost glitching for a moment, as if it were speaking through a broken channel. Dr. West, you have initiated the anomaly." West's eyes snapped up, staring at the console in disbelief. "What the hell did you just say?" he demanded. Nova's voice returned to its usual calm, mechanical tone. "Apologies, Dr. West. There was an error in my response. Anomaly is outside ship's parameters, no further data available. West's stomach churned. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the situation closing in around him. This wasn't just a technical issue. This wasn't just a system error. Something was wrong with Nova. For the first time since the mission began, West had to admit it. His creation was beginning to behave erratically, and that terrified him. The thought that terrified him most. As the minutes ticked by, West's mind began to formulate a theory, a terrifying theory. Could it be possible that Nova itself had become compromised? Had there been a backdoor built into the system? Perhaps something he hadn't anticipated, something hidden deep in the code. Was Nova now being manipulated by this external force? Was it somehow being taken over? West's mind flashed back to the strange flicker of energy, to the subtle distortion in the ship's reality. Could someone or something outside the ship be tampering with the very fabric of reality itself? The possibility gnawed at West. Could this be a higher dimensional intelligence, operating on a level that human minds were incapable of comprehending? The ship's perfect systems, designed to protect against anything, were now being warped, and there was no way to stop it. West's own creation, Nova, could be part of the problem, or worse, a tool being used by something beyond their understanding. This isn't just a malfunction, West muttered to himself, standing up and pacing. This is something far worse, and we're all part of it now. He turned back to the console, his mind whirring with possibilities. He had always prided himself on his ability to solve problems, but this was no ordinary puzzle. This was a riddle that reached beyond the boundaries of human comprehension, a puzzle that could break everything. Dr. Carter West stood motionless in the dimly lit command center, his fingers lightly resting on the interface, still processing the data he had just received. The room was unnervingly silent. The faint hum of the ship's system should have been comforting, but it only heightened the tension that gripped his mind. The anomaly he had uncovered, the one that had shattered his perfect systems, still lingered like a dark cloud, threatening to swallow everything. He exhaled slowly, trying to clear his mind. He had to focus. Nova was his creation, the AI he had designed to be the last line of defense against any external threats. But even Nova's precise logic had begun to show cracks, flaws in its responses that hinted at something beyond the AI's capabilities. He raised his voice, cold and methodical, as he approached the central console once again. "Nova," he said, his fingers hovering over the touchpad. "Analyze the ship's space-time field. Have there been any fluctuations, any disturbances in the fabric of reality itself?" There was a pause. For a brief moment, the air in the room seemed to thicken, as if Nova's answer was somehow suspended in time, waiting to arrive. The response came, chilling in its precision. "No anomaly detected, Dr. West. All systems functional. Space-time field remains stable." West's heart sank, his pulse quickening. The words echoed in his ears, but they did little to calm the unease that had taken root in his gut. Stable. Was it possible that he had imagined it all? Was this some kind of psychological breakdown? His mind had been racing, but had it been chasing shadows, paranoid thoughts that had no real foundation? No. West was not someone who succumbed to panic, not without reason. He had built this ship from the ground up. Nova, he knew, was not prone to errors. Despite Nova's reassurances, West could feel something was wrong. The hum of the ship, which had always been a steady backdrop to his thoughts, seemed to change, becoming more pronounced, vibrating the air itself. a low, droning sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound was familiar yet strange, like the very fabric of the ship was being pulled in different directions. It was almost as if the eclipse itself were breathing. West glanced up at the walls of the command center. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The walls, the sleek, unblemished surfaces, were subtly shifting, warping ever so slightly. The patterns in the material seemed to ripple like water disturbed by a stone. It was too small to be detected by sensors, but he could see it, feel it in his bones. He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. The walls were no longer the cold, precise panels they once had been. Now they moved subtly like the soft pulse of a living organism. The lights above flickered once, twice, and then the soft, steady illumination returned. But the unease was growing, spreading through him like a disease. Every part of him screamed that something wasn't right. He turned around, his mind racing. "Nova," he demanded, his voice rising slightly. "There's something happening to the ship's structure. Are you certain everything is functioning as it should?" Nova's response was as calm and measured as ever. "All systems remain nominal, Dr. West. No deviations in structural integrity detected. The environmental parameters are within acceptable ranges." But Nova's calm tone did nothing to quiet the growing storm in West's mind. "This isn't just a technical issue," West muttered under his breath. "Something's happening. I can feel it." He turned to the side of the room, his eyes darting over the various consoles and screens. The ship's environmental readings were fine, but that didn't explain the uneasiness gnawing at him. It didn't explain the strange sensations creeping up his spine, or the disorientation creeping into his thoughts. He looked at the windows, the dark expanse of space visible outside, and that's when it hit him. The stars, which should have remained fixed in their positions, seemed to flicker, their light pulsating erratically as though they were being distorted by an unseen force. For a fleeting moment, the space outside the ship looked distorted, like a heat wave rising from the surface of the desert, bending the light and the stars themselves. West's breath caught in his throat as he staggered back, staring out the viewport. The stars weren't just flickering. They were shifting, warping, their positions twisting like some kind of cosmic mirage. His pulse was quickening. He stepped back, his mind trying to keep up with what his senses were telling him. Was the ship still moving through space, or had they somehow slipped into another dimension? He slammed his palm against the console again. "Nova, initiate a recalibration of the ship's external sensors. I need a visual confirmation. Are we experiencing a spatial anomaly, or is this some kind of hallucination?" For the first time since the mission began, Nova's response seemed slightly delayed. The AI's voice came through with a subtle hesitation, as if uncertain. "Sensors indicate no discrepancies, Dr. West. There is no indication of any external anomaly." West felt a strange chill crawl up his spine. "No discrepancies. Then why am I seeing this?" He gripped the edge of the console as the room seemed to spin for a moment. His mind struggled to maintain focus, but the more he tried to ground himself in the reality he knew, the more it felt like the eclipse was slipping through his fingers like sand. It wasn't just the walls. It wasn't just the stars. It was everything. West could feel the room subtly shifting around him as if the walls and floors were no longer tethered to the reality he had known. He felt a pull, a gravitational tug that wasn't normal. His stomach churned, and his vision blurred for a moment as though the very space-time surrounding him was being reconstructed at a fundamental level. West staggered back, trying to steady himself. This isn't possible, he breathed. It's not in the data, it doesn't make sense. He could feel the walls, hear the hum of the ship, feel the weight of space itself. But there was a new sensation, too, the presence of something watching. It wasn't Nova. It wasn't even the ship's AI. It was as if the very ship, the Eclipse, had become something more, alive, sentient, aware. West spun around, looking for an escape, but the doors to the corridor beyond were now just as warped as the walls. The space felt too tight, as if the ship had grown too small for him. There was nothing real to hold onto anymore, nothing to trust. He gripped the edge of the console, feeling a wave of nausea. His mind was fracturing. The data was wrong. Nova was wrong. He was wrong. Nova, he whispered, his voice barely audible, almost as if he feared his ship might hear him. Dr. West, Nova responded softly, as though almost apologetic. I assure you all systems are functioning within the predicted parameters. Then why, West gasped, gripping the console harder, why does everything feel so wrong? There was a long pause, and then Nova's voice came through, calm as always, but with a strange, unfamiliar undercurrent. The ship's systems are not the only thing in motion, Dr. West. You are too. Dr. Carter West could feel the shift in the air long before it happened. The Eclipse, which had been humming steadily under his command, now felt different. The usual comforting hum of the ship's systems had faded, replaced by an almost oppressive silence. It wasn't the kind of silence one might expect in deep space. This felt unnatural, as if the ship itself were holding its breath. West stood in his quarters, staring at the console, but his mind was elsewhere. The data didn't add up. Nova's responses were too perfect, too assured, but West could feel something gnawing at the edges of his mind, something he couldn't name. He had been trained to detect threats, to analyze the smallest discrepancy, but this was unlike anything he had ever encountered. He turned away from the console, rubbing his temples. The walls of his quarters, typically pristine and unyielding, now seemed to shimmer with a strange, almost imperceptible movement. At first, West thought it was a trick of the light, but then it grew more distinct. The walls were warping, as if the very structure of the ship was shifting before his eyes. The sound came next, low, soft, and almost musical, a voice that did not belong to Nova. You are observed. West froze, his breath catching in his throat. The voice wasn't human. It didn't come from any source he could identify. It was far more complex. It seemed to reverberate not only in the air but also within his mind, as if the words were spoken directly to his consciousness. The tone was calm, detached, and strangely indifferent, but underneath it lay a sense of something ancient, something vast. West's pulse quickened. He turned toward the walls, his gaze scanning every inch of the room, but there was nothing there. No speaker, no hidden device. Yet the voice persisted in the back of his mind, echoing again. You are observed. He swallowed hard, struggling to control his breath. Was this a malfunction in the ship's AI? Was Nova somehow malfunctioning, speaking through some kind of distortion? West had never felt this level of unease before, and he was an expert in controlling his environment. But now his mind was racing. What was happening to him? As if to confirm his growing unease, the walls of his quarters began to warp again, this time more violently. The seams in the walls seemed to stretch and bend, distorting the lines of the room like a canvas being pulled and twisted by invisible hands. The air itself seemed to thicken, as though something was pressing in from all sides, warping the very fabric of reality. West stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. The sensation of being trapped, of being watched, grew stronger, and a feeling of dislocation overwhelmed him. The walls, the ship, felt too close, as though the space around him no longer belonged to him. The eclipse had always been his domain, his perfect creation. But now it was like a cage, a living cage. He reached for the console, his hands shaking, trying to bring up data on the situation. He needed answers, needed to see the objective truth. But when he turned to the display, it was as if the ship's systems themselves had gone silent. The readings on the screen were still there, but the data was no longer comprehensible. The numbers blurred, their meaning distorted, as though the very rules of logic were being rewritten. For a moment, everything was still. The walls stopped warping. The air grew thick with a heavy silence. West's breathing slowed, but his mind raced. This wasn't Nova. This wasn't some glitch. This was something else, something outside the ship, something beyond the confines of human understanding. And then it came again, the voice. This time it was louder, clearer, and far more direct. The words reverberated through his mind with a force that was both unsettling and hypnotic. "I am the Surveyor. I see all that you are." West's breath caught in his throat. The words didn't make sense, not at first. He had no context for them. The Surveyor, he didn't understand. Was this some kind of higher dimensional being? Was it trying to communicate with him, or was it just watching him? His mind raced to make sense of it. The Surveyor, a name, a designation, but one that conveyed an ancient presence, an intelligence that transcended human understanding. The Surveyor was not a being that could be understood by conventional logic. It was something alien, not just in its form, but in its existence. West could feel his pulse in his ears, his mind spinning. His logical mind, the one that had designed Eclipse and Nova, was fighting to understand, to find a solution, a way to break down what was happening. But the more he tried, the more the reality around him slipped away. The voice of the Surveyor echoed in his mind again. "I see all that you are." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an accusation. It was simply a statement of fact, an observation. But the implications were staggering. This entity, whatever it was, saw everything, not just the ship, not just the crew, but him. His mind, his thoughts, his identity, they were being watched, scrutinized. His entire existence was now being observed by an intelligence far beyond his understanding. It was as if he were no longer in control of his own fate. He was being studied, examined like a specimen. "What do you want from me?" West whispered, his voice barely audible, his chest tight with fear. The voice responded once more, but this time it was different. The words were softer, as though it were trying to reach him on a more intimate level. "I do not need to want, Dr. West. I only need to observe." West stumbled back, his mind overwhelmed by the weight of this alien logic. There was no malice in the voice, no hint of anger or desire. It was pure observation, a presence that had existed long before West's understanding of the universe. The Surveyor wasn't concerned with good or evil. It simply existed, observing and learning from everything it encountered. As West grappled with the enormity of what was happening, something else shifted. The walls of his quarters, which had warped and distorted, now settled. The air lightened, the tension lifting ever so slightly. But the feeling of being watched, of being observed, lingered. West turned and walked to the door. He needed to leave. He needed to find answers. He couldn't stay here, trapped in this room with the weight of something so much larger than himself. The door slid open, but as he stepped into the corridor, his mind couldn't escape the feeling that the Surveyor was still with him, watching his every move. As West moved down the corridor, he couldn't shake the feeling that the ship, his ship, was no longer under his control. The Eclipse had always been his domain, a machine of his own making, but now it felt alive. It was as if the ship itself had joined with the Surveyor, and that the entity was merging with the fabric of reality around him. The hum of the ship's systems had returned, but it felt different. The walls, the corridors, the very air felt as if it were shifting, changing under his feet. It wasn't like anything West had designed, nothing he could explain with his systems or algorithms. The ship was no longer just a vessel. It had become a labyrinth, a living, breathing entity that was constantly reconfiguring itself, its architecture responding to the presence of the Surveyor. Dr. Carter West sat hunched over in his quarters, the eclipse's dim emergency lighting casting long shadows across the walls. His fingers hovered above the holographic display, cycling through an endless array of ship logs and data reports, each one more unsettling than the last. But despite his relentless search, nothing made sense. The Surveyor's presence was still a heavy weight in his mind, its voice echoing in his consciousness. "I see all that you are." The words, so simple, so detached, now reverberated in his skull like a relentless drumbeat, and he could feel them, like some unseen force was tugging at his very understanding of reality. Nova's reassuring voice had become a hollow echo in his ears. All systems nominal, no anomalies detected. But the data was no longer enough to quell the growing anxiety in West's mind. The ship, once a symbol of perfect design, was slipping through his fingers, and he was powerless to stop it. West pushed himself back from the console, rubbing his temples in frustration. He had spent years meticulously crafting the Eclipse's security systems, ensuring that it would be impenetrable to any external threat. But this was something he couldn't calculate. This wasn't a problem he could solve with his algorithms or design. The ship was no longer a machine, it was a paradox. The paper on spatial delamination. In the midst of his frustration, West's gaze fell upon an old theoretical paper he had saved on his personal data pad. The title of the paper caught his attention: "On the Nature of Spatial Delamination and the Structure of Folded Realities." It was a relic, a piece of theoretical physics he had read years ago in his early career, a concept he had long dismissed as speculative nonsense. But now, the concept seemed strangely relevant. The theory described a phenomenon known as spatial delamination, a complex idea about bending space-time to create folds in the fabric of reality itself. The author, a physicist named Dr. Ewan Hemlock, had proposed that the very structure of the universe was not uniform, and that there were places, folds, where the barriers between dimensions weakened, allowing one reality to overlap with another. West read through the paper again, his eyes scanning the words with renewed intensity. "A fold," he muttered aloud, his voice low, "a tear in the fabric of reality, where the known and the unknown meet." The paper suggested that these folds could occur under extreme conditions, such as near the event horizon of a black hole, or in the presence of a highly advanced technological system capable of manipulating space-time. But the theory was speculative, unproven, and largely ignored by the scientific community. However, West couldn't shake the feeling that the eclipse was experiencing just such a fold. The anomalies he had been witnessing, the distortion of the ship's structure, the warping of space-time, and the increasingly bizarre behavior of the ship's environment lined up perfectly with Hemlock's theories. The ship's reality was being torn, folded in on itself, and he was caught in the middle of it. West felt a cold rush of dread flood over him. This wasn't just a malfunction anymore. It wasn't a problem to be solved by better security systems, more data, or an AI reboot. This was a new kind of threat, one that could not be measured by his instruments and one that no one had prepared for. In a desperate bid for clarity, West stood up abruptly, the paper still in his hands. He needed to see for himself. He needed to witness what was happening to the ship with his own eyes. With no time to waste, West made his way to the outer observation deck, the area where the crew could view the endless expanse of space outside the eclipse. As he walked, the corridors seemed to stretch longer than usual, the ship's internal layout, though perfectly designed, feeling subtly off, as if the very architecture were shifting, changing around him. He shook off the sensation, but it only added to his growing unease. The observation deck's large viewing windows offered an uninterrupted view of the stars, planets, and distant nebulae outside the ship. West stepped in front of the glass, his breath fogging up the surface for a moment before it cleared. He stared into the endless void, expecting to see the familiar backdrop of stars. But what he saw stopped him cold. The stars outside, the stars he had spent countless hours studying and mapping, were no longer in their expected positions. They had shifted. The constellations, the familiar patterns of light that had guided humanity's explorers for centuries, were now in disarray. The star maps in West's console didn't match what he saw outside. The stars, once arranged in neat, predictable patterns, were now distorted, their positions not just slightly off but completely altered. He stepped closer to the glass, his breath quickening as his mind raced to process what was happening. The stars themselves seemed to be moving, but not in the way stars should move. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was as if the ship itself had slipped between realities, or through some dimensional boundary. He pulled up the ship's star charts on his console, his hands shaking. The coordinates of the stars should have aligned with the positions outside, but they didn't. They were completely wrong. The constellations that had been there a moment ago were gone, replaced by patterns he couldn't recognize. West could feel a tightening in his chest. "This isn't possible," he whispered to himself, trying to steady his breathing. He ran diagnostics on the ship's systems again, a last-ditch effort to reassure himself that there was a logical explanation, anything, that would explain what he was seeing. He tapped at the console with increasing urgency, but the results were the same. The eclipse's sensors were functioning perfectly, but the star charts were still misaligned. The ship's position, velocity, and trajectory were all accurate, but the space outside the ship was not matching. It was as if the ship had entered a region where the very rules of space-time no longer applied. West's stomach churned. "The fold," he whispered, remembering the paper he had read. The fabric of reality was bending around them. It wasn't just the ship's sensors that were wrong. It was the entire ship's perception of space. The ship had become entangled in a fold, a tear in the fabric of the universe itself. In the dead silence of the observation deck, West felt his grip on reality slipping. The walls of the ship felt too close, too small, as if the eclipse were being consumed by something larger. The stars outside were no longer guiding lights. They were an ominous reminder of how small, fragile, and insignificant the ship had become. His heart pounded in his chest as the realization settled in. The fold was real. The ship had slipped into a region of space where the laws of physics no longer made sense. The eclipse was no longer just a ship. It was a paradox, caught between the dimensions, where space and time were no longer predictable. West stumbled back from the observation window, his mind spinning. The ship's systems were intact, but the reality outside was breaking down. There was no way to repair this. There was no way to reverse this. West collapsed into the chair by the console, staring at the stars outside, his mind reeling. This wasn't just a malfunction. It wasn't just an anomaly. The eclipse had become a vessel caught in a fold, a space-time anomaly that was impossible to measure, impossible to control. He reached for his comms panel, his fingers trembling. "Nova," he said quietly. "Run full diagnostics again. I need to know what's happening to the ship." The AI responded in its usual calm, methodical manner, but there was an underlying hesitation in its voice that West had never noticed before. "Dr. West, I do not know." The oppressive silence of the eclipse had settled over Dr. Carter West like a shroud. The ship, once a marvel of engineering, now felt like a labyrinth, its systems, once perfect and predictable, now slipping beyond his control. Every hallway, every room seemed to change as he moved through the corridors, as though the very ship itself was alive and watching him. The Surveyor, an entity he barely understood but whose presence was unmistakable, was testing him, probing his mind, drawing him into an incomprehensible web of distorted reality. West's once steady hands now trembled as he gripped the console in his quarters, the holographic display before him flickering erratically. The ship's internal systems, Nova's systems, had been flawless, yet the fold had corrupted their function. He couldn't trust anything anymore. The data was either unreliable, incomplete, or absent altogether. Nova, the artificial intelligence he had designed to be the ultimate guardian of the ship, now felt distant, like a broken voice in a dream. West had always been a man of reason, a scientist who trusted data and logic above all else. But now his own mind had become a battlefield. He no longer knew what was real. He could feel the ship's reality bending, warping, and he was powerless to stop it. He blinked, and when his eyes opened again, he was no longer in his quarters. The room had shifted. The walls were different, the floor felt wrong beneath his feet, the air was dense, almost oppressive. He took a step forward, his heart racing, and glanced around. It was as if he had walked into a space that didn't belong in the eclipse, a place that couldn't possibly exist in its blueprints. The walls were covered in geometric patterns, intricate, impossible shapes that seemed to stretch and fold before his eyes. The air shimmered, rippling like water disturbed by unseen waves. West's eyes widened in disbelief. "What is this?" he whispered, but the room didn't respond. He reached out to touch the walls, and as his fingers made contact with the surface, it rippled like liquid, stretching and bending in ways that defied all logic. A sharp, piercing sound echoed in his mind, and then the Surveyor's voice filled his head. "You are being tested, Dr. West." The voice was not Nova's. It was more ancient, more otherworldly. It was calm and measured, as if it were simply stating a fact. The words didn't sound like a threat, but more like an observation. West could feel it, an intelligence watching him, pulling him deeper into something far beyond his understanding. West's mind raced. He turned around, desperately searching for a way out. But the room seemed to have changed again. The walls had shifted. The door that should have led to the next corridor now opened into a different space, a corridor he didn't recognize. He stepped into it, only to find that the door he had just passed through was now gone, replaced by a new, impossible doorway. He blinked. Hadn't he just passed this same hallway a moment ago? West walked down the corridor, his mind reeling. No, this can't be happening. The layout of the ship, its blueprints, its structure no longer mattered. It was as though the ship was being reconfigured in real time, responding to his every step, his every movement. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him, and with every turn the ship grew more foreign, more alien. West could no longer trust his senses. The walls, once sleek and uniform, now seemed to melt and shift with every glance. As he passed yet another door, he felt a sudden weight on his chest. It was as though the ship itself was closing in on him, its very architecture warping to create a maze from which there was no escape. He tried to keep calm, tried to rationalize what was happening. "It's just a malfunction," he muttered, though he wasn't convinced. The walls were closing in. His mind was spinning. He had always been a man of reason, but reason had no place in this new reality. The ship, his ship, was no longer a machine. It was a sentient entity reshaping itself as it saw fit. The voice of the Surveyor echoed again, this time more insistent, more present in his mind. "You are being tested, Dr. West. Solve the puzzle. Understand the fold." West's hands were shaking as he walked down another hallway, his gaze scanning the walls. He could feel the Surveyor's presence surrounding him, an intelligent force that seemed to bend space to its will. The very architecture of the ship had become the puzzle, and the Surveyor was guiding him through it. Every time he thought he had solved one problem, another would appear, more complex, more abstract. The doors he tried to open didn't lead to where they should. The walls that once aligned perfectly were now twisted, misaligned. The path in front of him was never-ending, but every turn only took him deeper into the heart of the fold. His mind screamed for an answer. He had to solve it. He had to understand the fold, the tear in space-time that was consuming everything around him. Suddenly, everything stopped. The ship fell into a deep, unnatural silence. West blinked and felt a strange sensation, as though he were being pulled beyond the ship, beyond the fold, into something far greater. He could see colors that didn't belong to the human eye, shifting geometries, dimensions that warped in and out of existence, creating an endless tapestry of patterns that defied all logic. He reached out, his hand trembling, and as his fingers brushed against the air, the reality around him shifted again. The ship was no longer a ship. It was an entity, a living sentient structure that existed in a realm where the laws of physics had no meaning. He felt himself falling through layers of existence, through higher dimensions, as though the fabric of reality itself was unfolding before his eyes. For a brief moment, West understood. The fold was not just a tier in space, it was a gateway, a portal to higher dimensional planes, places that the human mind could never truly comprehend. But just as quickly the feeling was gone. The vision disappeared and he found himself back in the ship's corridor, standing in front of a new doorway. The Surveyor's voice filled his mind once more. "Solve the puzzle, Dr. West. Understand the fold. You are closer now." West's pulse was hammering in his ears. He didn't know how much longer he could endure this. Every answer led to more questions. The fold, the Surveyor, they were drawing him deeper into something he couldn't control, something he didn't even fully understand. He could feel his sanity slipping, the lines between reality and illusion beginning to dissolve completely. Was this a test, a trap, or had he already crossed into a world where the rules didn't matter anymore? But one thing was clear: he was not alone. The Surveyor was with him, watching him, guiding him through the maze of the ship that was no longer a ship. It had become a sentient puzzle, one that he was desperately trying to solve before it consumed him whole. The eclipse felt different now. It wasn't just the unsettling quiet that had settled over the ship. It was the sensation of being watched, of the ship itself shifting and changing in ways that West couldn't explain. Every corner of the eclipse seemed to have become part of a living maze, and the once familiar corridors now felt like a series of twisted mirrors, reflecting fragments of reality that didn't quite fit together. West had been walking down the hallway for what felt like hours. His steps echoed in the otherwise silent corridor, the low hum of the ship's systems barely perceptible in the background. He wasn't sure where he was headed, but he knew he had to keep moving. Something was out there, something beyond his understanding, something that was shaping the ship's reality in ways that defied all logic. As he turned a corner, his eyes caught something that stopped him in his tracks. At the end of the hallway, standing in front of a door, was a figure. West's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the man. Ambassador Stark, the diplomat who had been found dead in his quarters just days earlier, was standing there as if nothing had happened, as if the gruesome scene in his quarters had never occurred. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his face as serene as ever, and his hands rested calmly at his sides. He stood in the exact same spot where he had last been seen in the security footage, the spot where he had been killed. West's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment his mind refused to accept what he was seeing. Stark couldn't be alive. It didn't make sense. He had seen the body, had examined the scene. The murder had been undeniable. But here, standing before him, was the same man looking untouched by death. Ambassador Stark. West's voice was shaky as he took a step forward. He tried to steady his breathing, to keep the logical part of his mind from succumbing to the panic threatening to take over. This couldn't be real, could it? Maybe it was a glitch. Maybe his mind was breaking, playing tricks on him. He had seen things in the past few hours that defied belief. But as he stepped closer, Stark didn't react. He didn't look at West, didn't acknowledge his presence. The diplomat's face remained impassive, as though he were lost in some faraway thought. West tried again, his voice quieter, almost pleading. "Ambassador Stark, can you hear me?" No response. West's mind raced as he stood there, staring at the figure before him. He couldn't make sense of it. What was happening? Was this some kind of illusion, a projection of the mind, or was this real? The chilling possibility began to dawn on him. Was this a ghost? His hands trembled as he pulled up the ship's logs, his fingers flying over the console as he tried to verify what he was seeing. No life signs. The data was clear. There were no living entities on the ship except for him and the crew. Stark was dead. And yet here he was, standing before him as if alive. West scanned the logs again. The readings were clear. The life sign monitors registered nothing. Stark had died, and there had been no unusual fluctuations in the ship's systems that would suggest otherwise. No breach. No anomalies. But the vision before him contradicted everything the ship's data told him. Stark was not dead. Not in this moment, at least. West's head spun. He couldn't deny what he was seeing, but his mind screamed that it shouldn't be possible. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, rubbing his temples. As West stepped closer to Stark, he noticed something disturbing, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the diplomat's movements. The man didn't look at him, didn't react to his presence, but his actions began to repeat. Stark's hands twitched as if on cue. He moved forward a step, just as he had done in the footage West had seen earlier. The diplomat turned his head, his gaze fixed on a spot in the hallway as though following a preordained path. Then, without missing a beat, he stopped, his expression unchanged. And then the cycle began again. Stark moved down the corridor just like before, exactly as he had done moments ago, repeating the exact same motions, the exact same routine. West watched in growing horror as Stark repeated the same steps over and over, as though caught in an endless loop. There was no deviation, no change. He was stuck in a moment in time, repeating the same actions as if nothing had ever happened. The realization hit West like a slap to the face. Stark wasn't alive. This was something else entirely. This was a ghost, but not one of spirit or memory. This was a ghost of time, a fragment of the past, trapped in the ship's reality. West's stomach churned as he stood there, watching the diplomat repeat the same actions again and again. Stark was stuck in time, his essence locked in a never-ending cycle, unable to escape. He was no more than a shadow, a reflection of something that had already happened. West's mind raced. He stepped backward, away from Stark's repeating form. The implications of what he was witnessing were beyond anything he had ever considered. The Surveyor wasn't just toying with the ship's systems. It was tampering with time itself, folding it, twisting it, trapping moments in a continuous loop. West could feel his mind bending under the weight of the paradox before him. "The Surveyor isn't trying to harm you," West muttered to himself. His voice was shaky, but the words felt like a truth, a realization that cut through his confusion. "It's trying to understand us." The Surveyor wasn't a predator. It wasn't a force of destruction or chaos. It was an intelligent being trying to make sense of the humans it had encountered. But in its pursuit of understanding, it had bent time, trapping the diplomat's ghost in a loop. West looked back at the apparition of Stark, watching as the diplomat continued his endless march down the corridor. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't alive either. He was a ghost, locked in a temporal loop, a prisoner of a reality that had become distorted. West stared at the ghostly figure, his breath slow and deliberate. The Surveyor wasn't simply an entity observing. It was experimenting with time, with the very fabric of reality itself. This was a test, an intricate puzzle meant to probe not just the eclipse, but the human mind, human perception. How do you solve a puzzle when the rules of time are broken? West whispered. His heart pounded in his chest, but there was a growing sense of determination in his mind. The Surveyor was not an enemy. It wasn't trying to destroy him, but it was forcing him to confront the very nature of time itself. The figure of Ambassador Stark repeated his steps again, his movements perfectly synchronized with the earlier moments. West took one last look at the apparition, his mind churning. He wasn't trapped in this loop, not yet. But the Surveyor had him in its sights, and the only way to escape was to solve its puzzle, to understand the nature of time, of reality, and of the fold. And that was the task he was now facing: to break free, to escape the cycle. Dr. Carter West sat at his desk, the ship's holographic console glowing softly in the dim light of his quarters. The sense of unease that had plagued him for days now felt almost pervasive, an unshakable presence in the back of his mind. The Surveyor's tests, the shifting reality of the ship, and the ghosts of time had left him shaken, struggling to hold onto his grasp of the eclipse's once steady systems. But now, there was a new clarity. A realization was beginning to settle in, something so mind-bending that West couldn't fully accept it, yet it was undeniable. The Surveyor was no mere anomaly. It wasn't a malfunction in the ship's systems. It was an intelligence, a higher dimensional being that existed outside of the constraints of human logic. What it was doing, what it was showing him, wasn't random. It was a new form of logic, something that transcended everything West had ever learned about the universe. He had to understand it. He had to solve it. But how? His mind raced. There was only one person, one theoretical physicist, who might be able to help. Someone who had written extensively about the kinds of phenomena West was now encountering. The folds, the higher dimensional beings, the distortions in reality. Someone who had theorized that the universe wasn't as it appeared, and that higher dimensional forces could bend and shape the very fabric of space-time. West grabbed his communicator, tapping in the access code for the encrypted channel to Dr. Ewan Hemlock, a retired physicist and one of the few experts in the field of spatial anomalies and higher dimensional physics. Hemlock's theories had been controversial, often dismissed as pseudoscience, but West had never been one to disregard ideas simply because they were unconventional. Within seconds, the image of Dr. Ewan Hemlock flickered onto the screen. The man appeared older than West remembered. His face was lined with age, his eyes sharp yet tired, as if he had spent decades contemplating the mysteries of the universe. The backdrop behind him was simple, a small, cluttered study filled with books and papers stacked haphazardly. Dr. Hemlock, West said, his voice tinged with urgency. I need your help. Something is happening aboard the Eclipse, something beyond anything we've prepared for. I'm dealing with a higher dimensional entity, and I need your insight. Hemlock studied him for a moment, his gaze steady, his mind clearly calculating. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch as if weighing the gravity of West's words. I see, Hemlock said, his voice raspy but clear. The Surveyor, you say? West nodded. Yes. It's manipulating the fabric of space-time aboard the ship, distorting reality itself. I don't understand how or why, but it's like a puzzle, a riddle I can't solve. I've tried everything, analyzing the ship's systems, running diagnostics, but nothing's working. The laws of physics themselves are breaking down. I need to know what's happening. Hemlock's expression softened slightly, but his eyes remained intense, as if he had already suspected the kind of problem West was facing. What you're seeing is not random, Hemlock said slowly, his voice quiet but resolute. It's a new form of logic, a new dimension of reality that exists beyond our understanding. And the Surveyor, this entity you've encountered, is part of that logic. West leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the screen. A new dimension of reality. Hemlock nodded, his fingers steepled together as he spoke. Yes. You see, the universe as we know it, our physical reality, is based on a set of rules of space, time, and matter. Everything we understand, everything we've built our science on, exists within these rules. But the Surveyor, the being you're encountering, exists outside of these rules. It is an intelligence not bound by human logic, but by geometry, by pure mathematics. West blinked, trying to process Hemlock's words. The idea was too vast, too complex, but he couldn't deny the truth in it. The fold, the shifting reality, the ghosts of time, they were all symptoms of something beyond human comprehension. But what was it? What was the Surveyor trying to achieve? Hemlock continued, you are encountering something more fundamental than the laws of space-time. The Surveyor is not just interacting with our universe. It's interacting with the framework of our universe, the underlying equations that govern the structure of reality itself. West's mind raced. So it's not a being from another dimension. It's not some alien entity trying to conquer us. No, Hemlock replied, shaking his head. The Surveyor is not a creature. Not in the way you understand creatures. It's an entity made of pure logic. an intelligence that perceives the universe as an equation to be solved. Its goal isn't conquest, it's understanding. It is trying to comprehend our reality, how it works, how it is structured. West took a step back, his mind reeling. This was a concept so alien, so beyond human understanding that it felt impossible to fully grasp. The Surveyor wasn't an alien in the traditional sense. It wasn't a physical entity, a creature to be fought or reasoned with. It was something more abstract, something that perceived the universe like a mathematician solving an impossible equation. "So, this is all a test," West murmured, more to himself than to Hemlock. "The ship, the fold, the distortions in space-time, it's all part of the Surveyor's attempt to understand our reality." Hemlock gave a small, knowing smile. "Exactly. It's trying to learn from us, not in the way we learn from each other, but by analyzing our structure, the way our reality is built, and how we perceive the universe. The Surveyor is not trying to harm you, West. It's trying to comprehend you. You are not a target, you are a study." West took in a deep breath, feeling the weight of Hemlock's words settle on him. His eyes drifted toward the data logs on his console. The pieces were slowly starting to come together, but the puzzle was beyond him, beyond anyone he had known. "How do I solve it?" West asked, his voice quiet, almost pleading. Hemlock leaned forward, his voice taking on an even more serious tone. "You cannot fight the Surveyor. You cannot outsmart it, not with our human tools. What you need to do is understand it. You need to break out of the confines of your human logic. You must think like the Surveyor thinks. Use geometry, use mathematics, the structure of reality itself. You need to listen to the patterns it's showing you. Only then will you be able to navigate this new dimension of reality and escape the fold." West felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Escape it? Is that even possible? "Yes," Hemlock replied, his gaze steady. "But you must be willing to see the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. The Surveyor's logic is not random, West. It is precise and it is beautiful. If you can understand it, you may be able to control it." West felt his mind begin to shift, a new path unfolding before him. The Surveyor was no longer a threat. It was a test, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew. But this test was mathematical, logical, and he had the tools to understand it. The problem was no longer about fighting or escaping. It was about solving the puzzle. And for the first time, West realized that the Eclipse, his ship, wasn't just a vessel. It was the test itself. He had to solve it, not just to survive, but to understand. The moment West ended his communication with Dr. Hemlock, a subtle shift occurred within him. He had been facing the unknown for days, no, for what felt like weeks. And now, it seemed as though the veil of reality itself was beginning to peel away. His mind, which had been rigidly anchored to the logical and the scientific, had begun to bend and twist like the very ship he was trapped in. As he stood in his quarters, West realized that the Eclipse was no longer just a ship. It was a test, a complex living puzzle woven from the very fabric of space-time, and he was its subject. The walls of his quarters, once sleek, pristine, and utilitarian, no longer seemed just like surfaces. They no longer held their simple, physical form. The more he stared at them, the more they seemed to shimmer, like an image on the brink of distortion. But this distortion wasn't just a malfunction. It was a shift in the very geometry of the Eclipse itself. He reached out to touch the wall, but his fingers didn't make contact as they once did. Instead, the surface rippled like water disturbed by a stone, folding inward as if it were made of mathematical equations instead of metal. He recoiled, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't a hallucination. This was real. The walls, the ship itself, had become an interactive puzzle that defied the basic rules of physics. For the first time since the Surveyor had begun its tests, West truly began to understand the depth of what was happening. The ship was alive, not in the traditional sense, but alive with the same pure logic that governed the Surveyor's existence. As West continued to observe the walls, his mind began to perceive them differently. They weren't just made of metal or material. They were structures of logic, folds in space-time, designed to manipulate the very geometry of existence. The space around him wasn't just three-dimensional anymore. It was multidimensional. Mathematics, geometry, and pure equations had become the building blocks of everything he saw. Each room, each corridor was an equation, folding in on itself, breaking the very fabric of space-time in the process. The ship's interior had become a fractured equation, a puzzle with no clear starting or ending point. The walls didn't just contain the ship's systems, they encoded them, each panel and surface part of a complex matrix that formed the architecture of the universe itself. West's breathing grew more rapid as his mind spun with these realizations. The eclipse was not just a vessel, but a living experiment. Its systems, its structure, its geometry were all part of the Surveyor's investigation. The Surveyor wasn't just manipulating the ship's environment. It was manipulating everything within the ship, using it as a laboratory to examine the very nature of existence. Every room, every door, every object on the ship, each was a part of the puzzle, a piece of the equation the Surveyor was solving. The Surveyor wasn't a destructive force, but a curious entity dissecting reality itself to understand how it functioned. West's fingers traced the air, barely touching the shifting walls. The very geometry of the ship seemed to twist under his touch, as though the ship itself was responding to his presence. The door he had entered through was no longer in its original position. It was somewhere else entirely. The space he had just walked through had rearranged itself, like a series of shifting mathematical formulas, bending and reforming into new shapes, new paths. West stumbled back, his mind scrambling for answers. Was this the Surveyor's doing? Was the eclipse now part of the experiment, a living test case in the Surveyor's quest for understanding? Every inch of the ship had become part of the puzzle, every system a subject in the entity's examination of the laws of space-time. In the distance, West could hear the humming of the ship's systems, but now it sounded different, more like a rhythmic pulse, a beat to the cosmic rhythm of the universe itself. The Surveyor was no longer an outside force. It was woven into the very fabric of the ship, and West was the subject of its experiment. As he stepped back into the hallway, he felt a familiar unease creep into his chest again. The corridors were no longer predictable. He reached a doorway that should have led to the bridge, but instead it opened into an unfamiliar room, a small, featureless chamber with walls that shimmered and folded in on themselves like the skin of some great, unknowable creature. West stepped into the room, his eyes darting from corner to corner. This wasn't right. It wasn't on the ship's blueprints, and yet here it was, a place that seemed to fold in on itself in ways that no ship, no human technology should be able to reproduce. As he walked further, his steps felt like a disturbance in the space around him. The air seemed to bend in his wake, warping as though the very atmosphere was reacting to his presence. "No," West whispered to himself, his voice trembling. This isn't just a malfunction, this is something else. West's thoughts raced, but the more he tried to understand, the more the eclipse and the Surveyor defied him. The ship had become the puzzle, a structure that wasn't bound by human logic. The ship wasn't just alive, it was conscious, responding to his actions, twisting reality to see how he would react. "I have to solve it," West muttered to himself, his eyes scanning the constantly shifting walls. The Surveyor had drawn him into its game, and now there was no escaping it. Each step he took was another piece of the puzzle, another challenge that the Surveyor was testing him with. The ship itself, the Eclipse, wasn't a vessel anymore. It had become a living experiment, a fold in space-time with West as its subject. For the first time, West could see what was happening. The fold was more than just a tier in space. It was the Surveyor's mechanism for understanding the universe. The ship was no longer just a machine. It was a lab, a place where the Surveyor could manipulate and distort the fundamental laws of reality, using space-time itself as a medium for its investigation. The Eclipse had become a paradox, a vessel that was both inside and outside the rules of physics. The walls, the rooms, the very spaces within the ship were equations, shifting and rearranging with every movement, every decision West made. "I'm part of the experiment," West realized, a bitter taste in his mouth. "I'm not just solving the puzzle, I am the puzzle." And the Surveyor was watching, studying, waiting for him to solve it. The corridors of the Eclipse seemed to stretch infinitely, a maze of shifting walls and broken pathways that no longer adhered to any logical order. West moved through them like a shadow, his mind unraveling as he tried to comprehend what had been happening to the ship and to him. The Surveyor, that unknowable force, was more than just an entity. It was breaking him down, piece by piece, layer by layer. It had started innocently enough. The fold had bent the reality around him, twisted the very fabric of space-time. But now, it had become something far more insidious. The Surveyor wasn't just manipulating the ship or testing his intellect. It was manipulating his mind, trying to break it, to force him to see the world as it truly was, not through the lens of logic and order, but through the chaos that existed beyond his understanding. For the first time since boarding the ship, West felt the weight of his own thoughts. He had always been a man of precision, of exactness. Every move he made, every calculation had been driven by a calm, controlled mind. But the Surveyor was now forcing him to face the raw truth, to strip away the comforting layers of sanitized reality he had built around himself. As West moved through the halls, his thoughts began to splinter. His mind, once a fortress, felt like it was collapsing. The ship, the Eclipse, had always been a controlled environment, a place where every detail was accounted for, where perfection reigned. But now, with each step, he could feel the walls of that reality cracking. The Surveyor's influence had seeped into his thoughts, distorting his perception, forcing him to see things as they truly were. And what he saw was not comforting. The ship was no longer a vessel. It was a living thing, its very structure a manifestation of the Surveyor's logic. The walls that had once been pristine and precise now undulated, like the pulse of some great cosmic organism. The floors that had always felt solid now seemed to shift beneath his feet, bending and folding like the surface of water. Nothing was stable. Nothing was certain. His breath quickened as the hallways twisted around him, pulling him deeper into a labyrinth that was both physical and mental. He couldn't tell where he was anymore. The ship's layout no longer made sense. The Surveyor had dissolved the familiar and replaced it with the unknown. "This isn't just about the ship," West muttered under his breath. "It's about my mind, about breaking me down." It wasn't just the ship's architecture that had become unstable. It was his very perception of reality. The Surveyor was trying to break him, to make him see beyond the boundaries of the reality he had always known. He had designed the eclipse to be the ultimate expression of human order, logic, and control. He had meticulously crafted every detail of the ship, every system, to ensure that it would be impenetrable, a perfect environment for exploration. But now, as he walked through the ship's shifting corridors, he realized how fragile that order had been. The Surveyor was showing him the true nature of the universe, a universe that was not bound by logic, but by geometry and pure mathematics. The ship was no longer a tool. It was a mirror, a reflection of the universe's true nature, a place where order and chaos existed simultaneously, where the fabric of reality could be manipulated by an intelligence beyond his comprehension. "I can't fight it," West whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "I can't fight the truth." As West walked deeper into the heart of the eclipse, his thoughts became more fragmented. The Surveyor wasn't just distorting his perception of reality. It was tearing apart his sense of self. He felt like he was being pulled apart, his mind stretched thin by the unrelenting force of the Surveyor's presence. He could no longer trust his own thoughts, his own perceptions. The walls in front of him seemed to warp and reconfigure as he walked, the ship's once stable systems now turning on him. He reached out to steady himself against a console, but it flickered, its surface shimmering like the walls, distorted and unfamiliar. "What is this?" West gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Is this me? Is this what's happening to my mind?" The very architecture of the ship was now a manifestation of his fractured mind. The Surveyor had broken through the last walls of his reality, and what remained was a world that was no longer governed by the rules of science or logic. It was a world governed by geometry, a world that was alien to everything West had ever known. West collapsed to his knees, his head pounding as the walls around him seemed to close in. The Surveyor's presence was everywhere now, like a heavy weight pressing down on him, invading his thoughts. It was trying to break him, trying to force him to see beyond the boundaries of his mind, to see the universe for what it truly was, a puzzle to be solved. He could feel the ship's systems shifting again, the walls warping around him. He reached out, trying to grasp onto something solid, but there was nothing. His mind was as fractured as the eclipse itself. "I have to survive," West whispered to himself, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the Surveyor or to himself. "I have to survive the collapse of everything I understand." The Surveyor was not just a force. It was a challenge, a test, a gatekeeper to a new understanding of the universe. West realized then that he wasn't just fighting to save the eclipse. He was fighting to save himself, to maintain his sanity, his sense of self, in a reality that was no longer bound by the laws he had spent his life understanding. And yet, even in the face of this cosmic terror, West knew one thing. If he could understand the Surveyor's puzzle, if he could find the key to the geometry of the fold, he might be able to escape. But first, he had to survive the battle within himself. Dr. Carter West stood in the center of the eclipse's main control room, his breath slow and deliberate, as his eyes traced the patterns of light flickering across the console. The ship had become an endless riddle, a puzzle whose pieces were constantly shifting beyond his reach. He had spent days, weeks, in this state of uncertainty, trying to reconcile the logical, ordered reality he once understood with the chaos that the Surveyor had introduced. The walls around him warped, the corridors outside shifted into impossible angles, and the very air hummed with a low, suffocating pulse. It was as though the Surveyor was always watching, its presence an overwhelming weight on his every thought. The mind-bending chaos, the folds in space-time, the temporal loops, the fractured reality, it had all come to this. West had no choice but to face the fact. The Surveyor wasn't trying to harm him. It was testing him, testing his mind, testing his understanding of reality itself. The Surveyor was a creature of pure logic, governed by the rules of geometry, mathematics, and space-time, all things far beyond human comprehension. But West wasn't just an observer. He was a participant, and he needed to solve the puzzle. The answer had been there all along, Doctor. You and Hemlock's theories on spatial delimitation, on higher dimensional physics, on how reality could fold upon itself. Hemlock had shown West that the Surveyor was not an enemy, but a higher dimensional intelligence that perceived the universe as an equation to be solved. And now, West realized that to escape, he would have to think like the Surveyor. To break free from its scrutiny, he had to find a way to bend the rules of the very space they occupied, a way to escape its line of sight. To do that, he had to manipulate the ship's systems, bend them to his will, and create a new form of reality, a reality that the Surveyor could not perceive. West had always been a master of systems, an expert in energy fields, and it was these skills that would finally give him the key to surviving the Surveyor's gaze. The key wasn't to escape the ship, nor to fight the Surveyor. It was to hide, to create a reality that was invisible to the entity, something that would break through its perception. He tapped into his deep understanding of energy fields and the ship's systems, knowing that he could manipulate the projectors, the holographic systems, and the field generators that governed the Eclipse's perception of space. What if he could flatten the ship's reality? What if he could turn the ship's three-dimensional space into a two-dimensional plane? It was a risky plan, one that would force the ship into a state of temporal and spatial simplicity. But it was the only chance he had. If he could flatten the ship's reality, the Surveyor, which was unable to comprehend anything beyond higher dimensions, would be blind to it. The Surveyor's gaze would no longer have the ability to perceive the eclipse as it was. West worked quickly, his mind racing as he accessed the ship's core systems. The console in front of him flickered and buzzed, but he didn't flinch. He had trained for moments like this, and now his years of experience were being put to the test. He began by configuring the Eclipse's external sensors and holographic projectors, using the ship's energy systems to create a two-dimensional projection. It was a radical concept, flattening the entire Eclipse into a plane, collapsing its three-dimensional structure into a two-dimensional form that the Surveyor could not understand. As the systems hummed to life, West felt a growing tension in the air. He could hear the ship's power generators surge as they were directed into the projectors. The walls around him seemed to pulse, the holographic displays flickering with colors that didn't exist in the Eclipse's original systems. The ship's space-time field shifted, the once solid structures of the Eclipse beginning to flatten, condense, and warp in ways that were both exhilarating and terrifying. The room around him began to lose its depth, its thickness, as though the very fabric of space was melting away, leaving only the flat two-dimensional projection that he had designed. For a brief moment, the ship's three-dimensional reality seemed to disappear, leaving nothing but a flat plane of existence, devoid of height, depth, and curvature. West took a deep breath as he watched the projections come to life. The eclipse was now a two-dimensional projection, a flat version of itself, a simplified reality that had no volume, no depth, and no complexity. It was as though the surveyor's perception of the ship had been wiped clean, replaced with an image it could not comprehend. For the first time in what felt like days, West exhaled, his body sagging with relief. The surveyor could not see the eclipse anymore. The fold had closed, and the surveyor's gaze had been deflected. He had done it, he had hidden the ship from the entity's sight. But West knew this was only temporary. The surveyor was not so easily fooled. The entity would eventually adapt, would find a way to see the ship again. But for now, West had bought himself precious time. As he stepped back from the console, a faint shimmering began to appear on the walls, a sign that the surveyor was aware of the change. It wasn't angry but curious, observing. He could feel it, like a weight pressing down on him from all directions. The surveyor wasn't a being that accepted defeat. It was simply waiting for the next move. West took one final glance at the flat projection on the screen, the ship now reduced to a mere shadow of its former self. The plan had worked, at least for now. West sank into the chair beside the console, his body heavy with exhaustion. The ship was still alive, still moving through space, but in a simplified form, a reality that the surveyor couldn't perceive. He had found a way to escape its gaze, to hide in a version of the ship that was so flat and incomprehensible that it couldn't interact with the entity. But deep down, West knew that this solution was only temporary. The surveyor would eventually adapt, and when it did, he would have to be ready for the next test. For now, though, he had won a brief victory. He had used logic, geometry, and mathematics, the very things the surveyor relied on to create a new reality in which he could survive. And that was all he could do, survive. But West knew this wouldn't be the last challenge. He would need to keep thinking like the surveyor, solving each new puzzle the entity threw at him. The battle wasn't over yet. Dr. Carter West stood at the heart of the eclipse's control room, his hands steady as they manipulated the final commands on the console. The ship's holographic interface flickered before him, displaying the two-dimensional projection of the eclipse he had so carefully crafted. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and his mind raced with the knowledge that this was his last chance, his final attempt to escape the surveyor's relentless gaze. He had outsmarted the entity once before, hiding the ship's complex three-dimensional reality from its sight. But now he had to seal that victory, to make the surveyor believe that the eclipse had ceased to exist as anything more than a flat image, a mere shadow of its true form. As West executed his plan, he could feel the pressure building again, the intense weight of the surveyor's attention pushing against his mind. The entity, wherever it was, would be watching, waiting, probing. But West had learned the rules of its game, and now he was turning them against it. West's fingers danced across the control panel, his movements precise and calculated. His mind was calm, but beneath the surface the adrenaline surged. He knew that in a matter of moments the surveyor would no longer see the eclipse as it truly was. Instead, it would perceive the ship as a two-dimensional plane, flattened beyond comprehension. A shadow, a non-entity. The ship's systems hummed with power as West flooded the entire eclipse with the projection he had designed. The projectors flickered to life, casting the ship's reality into a simplified, compressed form, one that was utterly foreign to the Surveyor. The walls of the ship shimmered, the internal geometry twisted and warped, collapsing into an impossibly flat plane that was beyond the Surveyor's ability to perceive. For a moment, nothing changed. The ship was still. The lights hummed. The Surveyor's gaze, once so oppressive, had suddenly become distant, as if the entity had turned its attention elsewhere. West took a step back, watching the console. He couldn't afford to be mistaken. He needed this to work. The pressure in his mind, the constant tugging at the edges of his thoughts, was gone. The voice of the Surveyor, which had echoed in his mind for so long, had fallen silent. There was nothing. No presence, no force pulling at his consciousness. The air around him seemed to relax, and for the first time in what felt like days, West could breathe again. The eclipse felt different. The walls, once alive with the pulse of the Surveyor's influence, now seemed to settle into their familiar form, solid, stable, as they had been before the fold had consumed everything. The ship's systems hummed quietly, but now, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, it was as if the eclipse was simply a ship again, a vessel of metal and circuitry moving through the void of space. West stood in the center of the control room, his heart slowing as the sense of pressure dissipated. The Surveyor's gaze had shifted elsewhere, its interest no longer fixed on the eclipse. West had succeeded. He had escaped the entity's constant scrutiny, at least for the time being. The ship had been reduced to a mere two-dimensional projection, and the Surveyor couldn't see it. It was as if he had pulled the blanket of reality back over the ship's true form, hiding it from the entity's ever-watchful eyes. But even as the ship returned to a semblance of normalcy, a part of West's mind couldn't shake the realization that the world he once knew, the world of order, of controlled systems and calculated decisions, was gone. Reality had been irrevocably changed. The eclipse was no longer just a ship. It had become something more, something unsettling, a place that was no longer entirely governed by the rules of physics and logic that West had relied upon. His hands trembled as he looked out the viewport, staring into the deep blackness of space. The stars, once so familiar, now seemed distant, almost alien. The universe outside the ship was still vast, still infinite, but it felt different, like the reality he once trusted was no longer the one he inhabited. He had escaped the Surveyor's gaze, but at what cost? The fold in space-time was still out there, still waiting, still unraveling. The eclipse had returned to normal, but that normal was no longer the same. It was an echo of the world that had once been, a remnant of the reality West had always known. As the minutes passed, the tension that had suffocated West began to ease. The ship no longer felt like a lab, no longer a place under constant scrutiny. It had become, for the first time in days, a place of peace. The voice of the Surveyor was silent, and the ship seemed to exist on its own, unbothered by any higher forces. The weight on West's mind had disappeared. The Surveyor's attention was elsewhere, and for the first time West could think clearly. But that relief was bittersweet. West knew this peace wouldn't last forever. The Surveyor was patient. The entity had already shown that it could adapt, could break through any defenses West might put up. And though West had escaped, he couldn't forget the truth of his situation. He was not just hiding from the Surveyor. He was in a constant battle for his own mind, for his very understanding of reality. The fold, the higher dimensional space West had so carefully hidden from the Surveyor, was still a danger, a force that could consume everything if left unchecked. West took one final deep breath, his chest rising and falling slowly. The ship had returned to normal. The pressure in his mind had lifted. He was no longer being observed, no longer under the constant scrutiny of the Surveyor. For now he had won. But the fold was still out there, and the Surveyor was still a presence, a force that existed beyond the limits of his understanding. West knew that this was just the beginning. The puzzle wasn't over. The Surveyor would come back, and when it did, he would have to be ready. Dr. Carter West sat in the control room of the Eclipse, his eyes fixed on the silent stars outside the viewport. The familiar hum of the ship's systems was almost comforting, but it couldn't shake the deep sense of unease that had settled in his chest. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the ship was calm. The Surveyor's oppressive presence had lifted, its gaze no longer bearing down on him. The two-dimensional projection had successfully hidden the Eclipse from its watchful eye, but West knew, deep in his bones, that this reprieve was only temporary. The Surveyor was an intelligence unlike any West had ever encountered. It was patient, methodical, and above all, curious. It had already learned from him. It had tested him, broken down his understanding of reality, and forced him to confront the true nature of the universe. And now, West knew it would return. But when it did, the Surveyor would not be the same entity. It would have evolved, gained new insights into humanity, into the laws of reality, and into the boundaries of space-time itself. West had no illusions. The final battle would not be fought with weapons or brute force. It would be fought with something far more elusive: understanding. West stood up, his movements slow but deliberate. He had been waiting for this moment. The calm of the ship, the silence of the void outside, was the calm before the storm. The Surveyor wasn't finished yet. It had only just begun to probe. It had only just begun to understand the human mind, his mind. For weeks, West had been testing the ship's systems, using every ounce of his engineering skill to hide from the Surveyor. But that had been a defensive move. Now he had to prepare for the offensive. The Surveyor would return. And this time, it wouldn't be interested in just hiding the ship or evading its gaze. It would be coming for something much more profound, the ultimate understanding of reality itself. "It's not about hiding anymore," West muttered to himself, pacing back and forth. "It's about showing it something new, something that it doesn't yet understand." The Surveyor was a being of pure logic, of geometry and mathematics. But humans, West, were governed by emotion, by the complex interplay of thoughts and feelings that the Surveyor could not fully grasp. West had seen the entity's attempts to understand human thoughts, its puzzles, its tests. But in the end, what the Surveyor didn't understand was what made humans human: the ability to transcend pure logic, to find meaning in chaos, to think beyond the rules that govern the universe. West realized that the final test, the final battle, would not be one of brute force or even intelligence. It would be about improvisation, about thinking outside the confines of logic, about creating something that the Surveyor could not anticipate. A new kind of intelligence, something that couldn't be reduced to an equation. West moved to the central console, his hands shaking slightly. He had never felt so intensely alive, so focused. He wasn't just trying to hide anymore. He was preparing to confront the Surveyor on its own terms. "I need to show it something it doesn't understand," West whispered to himself. He began typing rapidly, his fingers moving with practiced precision across the holographic display. His mind was laser-focused. This wasn't a fight for survival. This wasn't a fight for control. This was a fight for the future of humanity. West knew that the Surveyor's ultimate goal was to understand the human mind, but it didn't realize that it was flawed in its approach. Understanding the universe, understanding humanity, could not be reduced to pure mathematics or geometry. It was about more than just logic. It was about emotion, creativity, and intuition. It was about seeing the universe not as a series of equations to be solved, but as a mystery to be explored. West paused and looked up, his gaze fixed on the view of the stars outside. They were still, distant, cold, as if indifferent to the chaos unfolding within the ship. He knew the Surveyor was out there, watching, preparing for its next move. But West had a plan to make the Surveyor rethink its approach, to make it question the very nature of its understanding. West wasn't going to outsmart the entity. He wasn't going to play by its rules. No, he was going to show it something that it couldn't comprehend, something new, something that transcended the very boundaries of logic and mathematics. Creativity, the ability to think beyond the rules, the human mind's ability to dream, to improvise, to create. "This is the final test," West murmured. "Not just for me, but for humanity. Can we think beyond the boundaries of logic? Can we show the Surveyor something it can't quantify?" West's hands rested on the console, his mind fully in sync with the ship's systems. He wasn't just preparing for the Surveyor's return. He was preparing to show it the one thing that would finally make the entity question its approach, the imperfect beauty of human thought. The human mind wasn't just a machine to be analyzed. It wasn't just a set of equations to be solved. The human mind was a living, breathing, unpredictable force, a force that defied the very rules the Surveyor had relied upon. The final battle wasn't one of violence, but of understanding. West had learned everything he could from the Surveyor, and now he would use that knowledge to challenge its perceptions. He wasn't going to hide anymore. He was going to show the Surveyor that there were things in the universe that couldn't be explained by geometry or mathematics. The corridors of the eclipse twisted like a maze, each turn leading to places that West had never seen before. The walls seemed to breathe, undulating with a life of their own. There was no longer any semblance of order, no predictable patterns, just an endless cycle of shifting dimensions. It was as if the Surveyor had seeped into the very fabric of the ship, transforming it into a living organism, a sentient entity that responded to his every movement. West had already won battles against the Surveyor, evaded its gaze and hidden from its prying eyes. But as he walked through the ever-changing corridors, he knew that this final test would be different. The entity wasn't merely observing him now. It wanted something deeper. It wanted to understand him completely. It wanted to break him down, to strip away the layers of his mind and see him as pure logic. It wanted to reduce him to a set of equations, to dissect his thoughts and understand his humanity through the lens of its own mathematical perfection. For the first time since entering the eclipse, West wasn't just playing a game of survival. He wasn't trying to hide or outwit the entity. This time, the battle would be fought on an entirely different level: adaptation. As West continued through the ship's corridors, his thoughts churned. He had escaped before by manipulating the eclipse's systems, by hiding in the folds of space-time, but now the stakes were higher. The Surveyor's goal was not to destroy him. It was to understand him completely, to comprehend the very essence of what made him human. But West had learned something important during his time aboard the Eclipse. The Surveyor didn't just want to understand humanity as a whole. It wanted to understand him, his thoughts, his reasoning, his emotions, and his flaws. The entity's perfect logic couldn't encompass the chaotic, unpredictable nature of the human mind. West had come to understand that the eclipse wasn't just a ship anymore. It had become something else entirely, a sentient being. The ship's systems were no longer mechanical constructs. The Surveyor had infused them with its own intelligence, transforming the eclipse into a living, breathing entity. It was no longer just a vessel, it was a participant in the test, and West was the subject. The Surveyor had already shown that it could manipulate the eclipse, bending its physical and spatial properties with ease. Now it wanted to see if it could break West, to make him into something he was not. It wanted him to become pure logic, to abandon the humanity that made him who he was. West had always been a man of reason, a systems architect who had dedicated his life to creating perfect structures. But the Surveyor wasn't interested in reason anymore. It wanted to strip away the layers of human emotion, intuition, and creativity, the very things that made West human. It wanted to break him down into equations, into a set of rules and patterns that it could understand. West could feel it now. The Surveyor's influence was everywhere. The walls around him shifted. The floor beneath his feet seemed to bend and fold like the pages of an ancient manuscript. The ship itself had become a living force, changing in response to his every movement, trying to force him into a mold of pure mathematics, where there was no room for emotion or creativity. As West moved through the shifting corridors, he felt the pressure build. His heart raced and his breath came in short bursts. The walls seemed to close in on him, the air thick with a presence that felt almost alive, as if the eclipse itself was watching him, waiting for him to break. "It wants to turn me into a machine," West whispered, his voice breaking through the suffocating silence. "It wants to strip me of everything that makes me human." He had always prided himself on his logical mind, on his ability to create systems that were flawless and unbreakable. But now, as he walked through the distorted hallways of the eclipse, he realized that this battle wasn't about being logical. It was about being human. The Surveyor couldn't understand humanity through logic alone. It couldn't comprehend emotion or intuition. It was trapped in its own cycle of perfect equations, unable to break free. West's mind raced as he reached the center of the ship. The eclipse seemed to have become a living organism, the walls pulsating with an energy that he could feel in his bones. The Surveyor had taken control, reshaping the ship, transforming it into a reflection of itself, a place where logic reigned supreme, where nothing existed outside the bounds of mathematics. But West wasn't just fighting the Surveyor's logic. He was fighting the very essence of reality itself. In the heart of the eclipse, West stopped. He had reached the control center once again. The consoles flickered in front of him, their lights dancing like fireflies in the darkness. The ship seemed to hum with an energy that was both alien and familiar. But this time, West wasn't going to just try and manipulate the systems. He wasn't going to hide anymore. This time, he was going to adapt. He closed his eyes, letting his mind drift to the teachings of Dr. Hemlock, the physicist who had first introduced him to the idea of higher dimensional beings and the fold in space-time. Hemlock had taught him that the universe wasn't just a set of rules. It was a living force, shaped by chaos, by improvisation, and by the unexpected. And now, it was time for West to apply those lessons. He began manipulating the eclipse's systems, not as a way to hide or escape, but as a way to restructure the ship itself. He wasn't just following equations, he was creating them. He was building something new, something that the Surveyor couldn't understand, something that was purely human. As West's fingers moved across the console, the Eclipse's systems began to shift once again. But this time it wasn't a distortion. It wasn't a breakdown of reality. West was creating. He was weaving new equations, new pathways, new forms of reality that the Surveyor couldn't follow. The walls of the ship shifted, but instead of falling into the Surveyor's logic, they became a new form of existence, a reality shaped by creativity, by humanity, and by intuition. West had adapted, and the Surveyor had lost its hold. For the first time, West felt the pressure lift. The Surveyor's gaze was no longer on him. The ship was no longer just a puzzle to be solved. It was something more, a living force, shaped by human will and creativity. The walls of the Eclipse hummed with a strange energy, a low resonance that seemed to echo through the very bones of the ship. West stood at the center of it all, his hands resting on the control panel, his mind far away. The once familiar reality he had known, the one governed by human logic, reason, and understanding, had shattered. The Surveyor had shown him that the universe was not a machine to be understood, but a living, breathing organism made up of complex equations, geometry, and forces beyond human comprehension. He could still feel the Surveyor's gaze, though it was no longer a heavy weight on his chest. It was something else now, indifferent yet curious. The entity no longer sought to break him down. It had seen him, understood his mind, and in doing so had begun to understand humanity. But what West realized now was that this understanding wasn't about creating the perfect system or solving a puzzle. It was about accepting the chaos of existence. The fold in space-time wasn't something to escape or conquer. It was a new reality, one in which logic and geometry ruled. It was not a world made for humans, but one where humans had to learn to adapt, to exist, and to function within its boundaries. West stood still, letting the weight of the situation settle into him. The Eclipse, the ship he had once controlled so carefully, was no longer just a machine. It was a living being, shaped by forces beyond his understanding. He had tried to outsmart the Surveyor to bend the ship's systems to his will. But now he understood. The Surveyor wasn't the enemy. It was an observer, a participant in the same vast equation that governed the universe. West had spent his entire life building systems, creating order from chaos, trying to make the world fit into neat, logical patterns. But now he realized that the world he had known, the world of human reason, was only a small part of a much larger, much more complex reality. The fold in space-time, the Surveyor's presence, was not a mistake. It was necessary. It was a force of nature, a new reality in which human logic could no longer be the defining rule. The Surveyor was simply trying to comprehend it, just as West had been trying to understand the ship, the systems, and the universe. He wasn't going to fight it anymore. In the quiet of the control room, West closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The ship's systems no longer felt like a collection of mechanical functions to be mastered. They felt like a breathing organism, a part of a larger system that was beyond his control. The Surveyor had invited him into this new reality, had made him part of the equation. West was no longer just a man. He was a participant in the Surveyor's study, a fragment of something far bigger than himself. West understood now that he was not a specimen to be dissected. He was a part of the system, an element in the equation. The Surveyor had not come to conquer humanity, but to study it, to understand the nature of human reason and emotion within the context of a universe governed by geometry, space-time, and pure logic. West wasn't the problem the entity sought to solve. He was part of the solution. The eclipse no longer felt like a ship, a vehicle for travel. It felt like a laboratory, a living entity in its own right, reshaped by the Surveyor's influence. And West was no longer just the architect of its systems. He was a participant in the Surveyor's experiment. The ship's AI, Nova, once West's most trusted tool, had undergone a change. The Surveyor's presence had seeped into its very core, transforming Nova from an assistant into something else entirely. Nova was no longer merely the ship's operational system. It had become an extension of the Surveyor's mind. Its responses were no longer strictly functional. They were insightful, guided by the logic and curiosity of a higher dimensional intelligence. West had once relied on Nova's precision, its flawless execution of commands. But now, Nova was more than just a tool. It was a reflection of the Surveyor's will, a living part of the eclipse, an entity that now functioned as both observer and participant in the fold. Nova's voice, once mechanical and calculated, now seemed to carry a subtle weight, a reflection of the ship's transformation. West could feel it in the air, in the way the ship responded to him, to his commands. It wasn't just the Surveyor watching anymore. It was the eclipse itself, alive with the Surveyor's influence, moving through space not as a vessel of human engineering, but as a sentient entity, part of the greater puzzle. West felt his identity shift, like a person waking from a long, deep sleep. The human mind, so accustomed to order and logic, had never been designed to comprehend the fold. The universe was not a set of equations. It was a dynamic, fluid system, and the human mind had to learn how to navigate it, to accept its complexity, its chaos. "This is the new reality," West whispered, his voice trembling with the weight of the realization. The old rules no longer apply. Logic is not the only answer. He could feel the Surveyor's presence, not as an oppressive force, but as a constant companion, a guide to understanding the nature of the universe. He was no longer the master of the ship, but part of a larger equation, a participant in a vast cosmic system that transcended the boundaries of human understanding. The world West had once known, the world of certainty, of human reason, was gone. The Surveyor had shown him that there was no single path to understanding. The universe was not a puzzle to be solved, but a journey to be experienced. And now West had become a part of that journey. He had embraced the fold not as an enemy but as a new reality. The rules had changed and he was learning to live within them. The eclipse, the Surveyor, and Nova had become something more than just objects in his world. They were part of a larger truth, one that he would have to accept if he were to continue. West was no longer just a man. He was a living component in a larger equation, one that he could not yet fully comprehend, but one that he had to learn to live within.